All right, so this is episode 2 of Dead Bodies and Domestic Advice, which is a series based off of some long-running research that I've been doing. Last episode's subject was about women and healing and work in the pre-19th century, which leads up to how wives took care of dead bodies. So I am once again your host, Victor, and joining me today is Sean. Sean, who are you?
Hi, I'm Sean. I am also a history major. I'm double majoring with classics, and I am here because I also love death.
Rad. So let's talk about that. The first thing I want to start with is talking a little bit about what other historians have done when talking about death, because some of it's really cool and some of it's not really cool. And so this is specifically about people who have studied death in the United States. But two things I really want to touch upon is that, as I talked about last episode, women's work tends to get overlooked, and it certainly has been overlooked in the historiography that I'm working with for this research. So the first thing is James Farrell's Inventing the American Way of Death, which is a book that I'm sure you haven't read, but I had to pick through for this. There is one page on which he mentions women who had laid out the dead. And the quote is, "He or she, for often these last rites were performed by women, placed a board between two chairs, draped it with a sheet, laid the body upon it, and washed the corpse." And then he continues on with other preparations for the body. Sean, what do you think my issue with that sentence is?
It's saying that this work was mostly done by women, but women are just kind of an addendum in that sentence where it's just saying, or she.
Yeah, it's so annoying that he's like, yeah, this work was mostly done by women, but I'm gonna put them in brackets. So that's extremely irritating to me. And then the other is Gary Laderman, who wrote The Sacred Remains, among other books about death. And he mentions women taking care of dead bodies. And he mentions Martha Ballard, who we're going to talk about in depth. But he's like, oh, yeah, she was this midwife and she also took care of bodies. Anyways, all this stuff about men. I chose those two scholars in particular just because I've handled their work a lot. And I want to sort of set the stage for what some other scholars have done, specifically Georgianne Runbland and Carol K. Weaver, who wrote these two articles about women's care of the dead pre-market, who I think did a phenomenal job in terms of finding evidence, especially from diaries and business directories, and really showed that women were there. Unfortunately, I can't use any of it because their scope is outside of New England. But then ended with yeah, so women were involved in this work, and after it became a professionalized thing, maybe they were there, maybe they weren't. So there's all sorts of gaps in the research, and any gaps that I have, I will fully acknowledge, which is why I should acknowledge now, actually, because we're going to talk about Martha. And very unfortunately, her diary is really all that I have in terms of pre-19th century or pre-professionalization more, because her diary goes until 1812 when she died, starts in 1785. So, she's leading into the 19th century, but it's just so phenomenally hard to find written accounts by women, because as you will undoubtedly know from classes that you've taken, no one, or not no one, but the broader patriarchy doesn't care about what women have written, so it was just tossed away. So we're phenomenally lucky to have Martha Ballard's writing, which I now want to get into. So, like I said before, Martha Ballard kept her diary from 1785 until her death in 1812. She died at 77 years old. Martha Ballard was a midwife, healer, and she took care of dead bodies. And she lived in Hollowell, Maine, which is really cool because it's right next door to where I live in Augusta. So that's rad. She did take money for delivering babies and for making and delivering medicine to neighbors, but she wasn't a professional, and she wasn't engaged in the economy in the way that we've come to think about engaging the economy in this capitalistic way, where it's you have to have a job, and that's outside the home. So this is still very much inside the home, or at least inside domestic spaces. And the other thing I want to say about Martha before we delve into all of the dead body stuff is that she, being a wife was extraordinarily important to her. She, in her diary, of course, refers to other people that she interacted with, but doesn't refer to the women by anything other than their last names if they're married. She mentions like daughters and nieces and stuff by their first name, but the minute they're married, it's like Mrs. and like that's it. You're never going to hear their first name again. Can make it kind of confusing to read, but I think it's very pertinent, especially to my overarching thesis that like this is a woman's thing or a wife. Sorry, I'm fucking up my own thesis. It's a wife's thing. That their role gave them the power. So I want to make sure we're clear about this. Now, I picked through her diary myself. I'm aware, as I said, Gary Lederman talked about her diary. Laurel Thatcher Ulrich has obviously written A Midwife's Tale and other articles that contain Martha's diary as a primary source. Like her diary has been pretty picked through, but I just didn't see that much evidence for talking specifically about what she did with dead bodies. So that's why I wanted to explore it, other than it just being like the only source I have. And I want to get into what exactly she did with dead bodies and like what effect this had with her community. So the first thing I want to talk about is a quote that I have from Martha's diary, which I love. It's from September 16th, 1800. The quote goes, "Clear, I was called at 6 hours this morning to go and assist to put Nabby Andrus in her grave clothes. Dr. Coney dissected her, found her complaint was in the uterus. It contained 1 gallon of water together with other substance. The weight of it after the waste was taken out was 7 pounds. The liver weighed 3 pounds. The trunk of her body contained a large quantity of water. The frost killed my vines this night." Sean, what's your immediate reaction to this quote?
Just how like she goes into like this depth of like, here's all the stuff that we found inside this body, and then just like, also my vines died. It's just like very casual. And another thing that kind of sticks out to me, I don't know if this is normal, but a gallon of water in the bladder seems kind of insane. I don't know if that's a lot.
You know, neither do I. Maybe after this, I should look up how much an average bladder contains. But yeah, like it's super detailed, and she's doing this dissection, or like she's not performing it, but she's witnessing this dissection done by a respected doctor in the community, Dr. Coney, who, for anyone who knows, like Augusta, Maine, he created a female school that has now become like the local high school. So like this is a person that has a lasting legacy. And his interactions with Martha we'll get more into, but that sort of sets the stage for what she's done. So Martha took care of dead bodies in her community. She was called to take care of dead bodies, not only when she was there, like people would be sick and she would nurse them and they would pass and she would take care of the dead bodies, but also people in the community would die and she would be called from home or from another place where she was taking care of a sick person, or had been taking care of a mother who had just given birth, to go take care of dead bodies. And that just goes to show that like the community, you know, was like, if something goes wrong, if someone dies, we should get Martha. So her intelligence was respected. But I also want to make it clear, because if this was just a Martha thing, then my whole thesis of this is a thing that wives did would like immediately fall apart. So I'm not shooting myself in the foot here exactly, but other wives did this. There's 2 occasions on which Martha notes bodies that were taken care of specifically by other wives and not herself. On October 12th in 1804, Mrs. Savage and Mrs. Fletcher put the grave clothes on Martha's grandson, Thomas. All 3 women had been nursing the sick boy, and when he finally passed, it was up to the other 2 wives to take care of him. And I think the immediate reaction to that might be, well, this is her grandson. She might have been too like emotionally distraught to do this, which is, I think, an entirely fair analysis, if it were not for the fact that she also notes that on January 21st, 1810, Mrs. Hamlin, North, and Wade dressed the body of Mrs. Babcock. And the fact that Martha also attended other funerals in the community that she didn't note taking care of the body. So here were other wives who delivered babies with her, nursed the sick with her, and dressed the dead. And like they all had this expertise, enough that Martha, who was by no means like this overarching authority figure, you know, trusted to do it. So it was like this communal task that all of these wives were engaging in. And Martha was also not the only midwife or wife in general in town or in the region to to gain this sort of respect. But there are some instances I want to talk about with dissection that really go to show just like how well respected she was, and also how it wasn't really a question about whether or not wives could be involved in like the taking care of dead. So there are 4 instances on which she witnessed a dissection. The first one was the quote I read previously. She also witnessed the dissection of Mr. Davis's son, who in attendance with that were Judge North, as well as Martha's son, John. She also witnessed the dissection of Rachel Savage alongside 10 doctors and 3 midwives. That particular one was the last one she witnessed in 1808, and she was 73 years old. So clearly they still had a trust in her knowledge at such an old age, or her ability. And she also witnessed the dissection of Mrs. Pitts, but there wasn't any notes about an audience, but she still had the opportunity to do that. In each case of dissection, she describes what was wrong with the body. So in the case of Nabby Andrus, as I said, her uterus and bladder were severely swollen, and there was a lot of water in her body. So she notes that as like, oh, this is what caused her to die. And it's very interesting to me that she's doing this because this is, and she's involved in this because this is a time when medical knowledge is like incredibly safeguarded. Like you and I don't have like a full medical knowledge, but we can research things, and it's not like doctors aren't going to give their research like to people, like it's accessible in an academic community. But like, and as I said last episode, doctors were writing like their own code to like not tell the public what was up with bodies or like health in general. So it's a little, I think that's weird, not to put my like modern conception upon it, but it's a little weird. Right. Obviously understandable from like the elitist and patriarchal mindset, but it's very different from what we do in the 21st century. And so these were all the things that Martha did, and it was like plain and natural to her. I mean, like her diary is a very classic early New England wife diary where wives were encouraged to keep such accounts, but they weren't really like diaries in the sense we think about where you like spill your emotions to it, because this is a practical God-fearing woman who has traveled from Massachusetts to Maine. She's not originally from Maine, to live on this farm with her husband, who is gone often. She has all these children. She's part of the community. Like she has things to do. So diaries were much more of account books than they were supposed to be like emotional releases at the time. But, and this is one of the last things I want to talk about Martha before I can get your opinion on all of this, but she does put emotions in certain circumstances, which makes absolute sense. It's not like she's a cold-blooded machine. But especially when talking about dead bodies and where that emotion comes through, it's incredibly interesting because she actually had, I don't want to say a feud, but definitely tension with Dr. Coney. And so this was towards the end of her life, 1799. So she was not, this was 13 years before she died, but she's still an older woman. She must have been in her 60s at this point. And she's been doing this for a very long time. She's delivering babies. She had a very, very low infant and mother mortality rate. She's very good at what she does. And what that made Dr. Coney feel, I can't say, and no one can say because these aren't things that he wrote down either. But there are instances where we get this look at how women healers and women care of the dead were put into conflict with medical professionals. So on October 24th, 1799, Martha wrote this entry into her diary, which says, "Brother Moore called to see us, and we desired him to request Dr. Coney to come and see him. He arrived here at 10 hours in the evening and gave him physic and accused me with going to Mr. Dingley's in his sickness and objecting to his prescriptions and prescribing some of my own and setting Mrs. Dingley crying by giving my opinion of this disease and said this was one of many instances I had done so. So which I must deny till he or some other can bring it to my recollection. This is a world of trials. May those which I am called to meet with serve for my good." And then 2 days later, she continued with, I informed Mr. Dingley of what Dr. Coney had laid to my charge concerning my conduct with him in his sickness. He declares no such thing mentioned by him or his wife as the doctor represented to me. There was quite the reverse. The mistake, if one, seemed true. What do we think of these quotes, Sean?
Kind of seems like he's trying to undermine her authority, even though obviously like Martha knows what her job is. She knows what she's doing. She's not, and she's seen all these autopsies. She's very educated in what's going on. And so to say that like that she's just throwing stuff around is kind of ridiculous.
Yeah, I would definitely agree. I mean, doctors would give prescriptions and those were expected to be carried out by either the person's wife or if they were unavailable, another wife in the community. So the doctor was not having like complete oversight of care. How Dr. Coney felt, like what led him to do this, I can't say for sure. I can't really speak for people in the past besides the sources that they give us. But what it does sort of lead to is what episode 3 we'll talk about, and then later in episode 4 is this like slow drive out of women from care of the dead and replacement with a more masculine industry. Martha is sort of the tail end of like women's control of dead bodies. Now, as we'll get into in the next episode, this sort of complete drive, this complete split doesn't happen until 1860 with the Civil War. And so it's kind of quiet for a couple of decades before we get there, but all of it's remarkably interesting. And as the next episodes will show, despite people's best efforts, women were still involved, but not without like a grand amount of erasure and a grand amount of undermining by their male counterparts and colleagues. So that's Martha, that's her story. And I'm glad that you could listen to it.
Yeah, thank you.
No problem.